All right, psych students, next we are going to progress to smell, or scientifically, as we would say, olfaction. An interesting point about the sense of smell, which makes it different than any other sense, is that it goes directly to the brain. So it's the only sense that goes directly to the brain. In other words, what I mean by that is that the receptor cells in our nasal passage are wired directly into the base of the cerebral cortex. More specifically, in areas known as the olfactory bulbs, which it turns out are at the base of the cerebral cortex. So how smell works is that airborne molecules will enter into our nasal passage and then stimulate the receptor cells. So if you look closely there, you can see that the receptor cells are located at the back. And if we magnify that here, we see that their axons are tied directly into the cerebral cortex. So once again, only sense that goes directly to the brain. All right, so let's get into some different points about olfaction. In terms of the receptor cells, or the different types of receptor cells, this has not been known until the early 90s. So prior to 1991, this was unknown. But at this point, we have identified hundreds. And not only that, we think that those receptors combine to form over trillions of odors. So in other words, in terms of the olfactory sense, we know it's very complex. Obviously, the sense of smell is tied directly to food selection. You know, for example, when you eat, you also smell your food, and we think the brain combines that into flavor. Most of you have probably noticed when you have a cold, you don't taste food as well as you normally do. So obviously it's directly tied to taste. In fact, you've probably seen those TV shows where people are plugging their nose to not taste something. So it turns out that taste and smell are very intertwined to the point where it gets difficult to separate them in the research. Remember, they're both chemoreceptor type senses, and so we see a lot of overlap between them. Psychologists believe that the sense of smell is not only for taste and for flavor and food consumption, but we think it serves social purposes. In other words, we think one of the reasons that we can smell things is to receive social messages. So the classic example of this one is pheromones. So when we look at the animal kingdom for this one, we find tons of examples. For example, if you have a male dog at home, you may notice that when you let them out in the backyard, they'll go around and they'll pee around the perimeter of your yard. Have you ever wondered why they do that? Well, it turns out that they have these chemicals called pheromones, which act as messages, and we think they're released into the environment to serve for communication. Typically, it's related to reproduction, but in this case, it's a little bit different. We've discovered that there are pheromones in male dogs' urine, and they use this to mark their territory. So it turns out many animals do this, but dogs specifically do this to communicate to other dogs, hey, this is my turf, stay away. So in other words, they're creating little signposts through these chemical messages. So it turns out that we've discovered humans secrete these as well. Of all things, we have discovered that male body odor contains pheromones. And not only that, we think that females who are exposed to that, now in this case we're saying you're not biologically related to that other person, but females who detect male body odor, we have discovered that it may change the sexual part of the brain. In other words, it alters the functioning of your reproductive system. There's been studies that have shown that women who are segregated from men for long periods of time will actually stop menstruating. So that may be some evidence for the lack of these messages present, which creates a change. Another example would be, so ladies, we're going to get a little personal here. If you've ever lived with female roommates who are not biologically related to you, you may have noticed that your menstrual cycles will start to synchronize. Have you ever wondered why this happens? We think that during that special time of month, pheromones are secreted, and the other females detect that, which changes your brain and thus your reproductive functioning and creates the effect of getting them to synchronize. So we think that may be why this happens in a college dorm room, for example. All right, so just to recap, we think that the sense of smell obviously is linked to diet and food consumption and detecting odors, for example, but also we think it's for social purposes, whether it's for some type of communication or reproductive issue. All right, so that concludes our short lecture on olfaction. Please progress to the next step in the class.